Okay. Hello.
Hello, Alexander. So, Alexander, I'd like to introduce you to Ibu Tri Sulistiawati. So, Ibu Lilis is the Associate Dean of the Law School.
My pleasure, Dean.
Bu Lilis, ini Dr. Alexander. So I think we still have 4 minutes, and Oberta will be the host for the show, for this event. And a guy named Abdurrahman Satrio or Rio will translate the event. So, terus apa lagi Mbak ini?
Kita tunggu sebentar lagi ya Mas, sampai 4
iya.
menit lagi. Kan kita mulai jam 3.
So Alexander, the sequence will be Oberta open the event, and then I will provide some sort of a preliminary remark, and then after that you will have discussions with them.
Mm-hmm.
And then there will be some question and answer at the end.
Yep. Brian,
All right.
I'm aiming for about 40 minutes with the interview and then afterwards questions, or shorter, longer?
Can you repeat again?
How long should we do the interview for and how long for questions and answer?
Yeah, I think it's similar with the previous, you remember?
Yep.
So I think you should leave like maybe 15 minutes for question and answers.
Okay, I might leave a little longer because last time there was a lot of questions and we ran out of time. So I might add a little bit extra for questions.
Okay, I think that's better. So because I will only takes like maybe 5 minutes.
Okay. Alberta, are you a host for the Zoom call?
I was, yes.
Yep.
Should I give you the host?
Yes, that'll be nice actually.
Okay. Go host.
Kasih.
Buiinnya kemana, Mbak Lilis?
I'm so sorry before.
Ada ini.
Oh, ada.
I'm so sorry. Then, so actually you're already the co-host.
Yeah, I've got it now.
Yes, no worries.
I'm the host today then. It's me. Hello, Mr. Alexander.
Hello, Dean.
Thank you for present today.
Well, I'm very glad and thankful for the invitation.
And also current research, Alexander, current research is on Chinese contract law, right? Alexander, you're working on Chinese law now, Chinese contract law?
I will be shortly, yes, as a continuation of the studies on Asian contract law. That's true.
So do you think, Alexander, is it important to do fieldwork to produce legal scholarly writing?
I'm sorry, Pran. The connection was so that I haven't understood your question properly.
Right. So do you think you? So I think we already have 3 now, right? I think we should start. Oberta, I think we should start now.
Oke, sebagai bentuk tata krama dalam pertemuan virtual, saya mohon kerjasama para hadirin untuk menyalakan kamera komputernya. Selain itu, bagi para hadirin yang ingin menyimak acara dalam bahasa Indonesia, silakan untuk mengklik interpretation dan memilih Indonesian. Untuk memastikan Anda mendengarkan suara dalam bahasa Indonesia, silakan untuk mengklik mute for original sound. Tidak lupa kami ingatkan juga kepada para audiens untuk menggunakan virtual background yang sudah disediakan oleh komite. Okay, greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our scholarly legal speaking series held by the Collaboration of Faculty Law of Trisakti University and the Institute for Migrant. I am Obera Tracy Chayadi, a final year law student at Trisakti Faculty of Law, and will be the host for today's discussions with Dr. Alexander Gribano of the University of Warsaw, namely a common contract law in Asia. The discussions will be led by Dan Trevenon, the program manager of the Institute for Migrants' Rights and the host of AGIL's podcast. Without any further ado, let's just get started. First, we will be having an opening remark from Mr. Pranoto Iskandar, the founding director of the Institute for Migrants' Rights. The time is yours, sir.
Thank you, Oberta, and good afternoon to speak again at the second installment of this lecture series, following up on Tim's inaugural lecture in which he discussed the fundamental making sense of law. As second speaker, Alexander will discuss a subject that is no less essential and hence vital in the field of modern legal studies. In this opportunity, I'd like to give a brief introduction of today's subject, similar to what I did for the previous, to help you understand the backdrop of today's topic, which is the principle of Asian contract law, a project that could be described as a regional effort with the goal of establishing a standard contract law for Asia. To appreciate why it is an interesting topic in and of itself and what value Alexander might offer to it, one must first acknowledge Asian realism as an influence on the conceptual side of principle of Asian contract law and how principle of Asian contract law as a project would unfold. For starter, Asia demonstrates radical pragmatism in international affairs. In other words, rather than a self-identity or aspirations, what motivate Asian states or governments to take a certain stand or policy on most, if not all, international issues have tended to revolve around narrowly shared national interests. As a result, it's no surprise that Asia is the least developed region in terms of regional integrations or regionalism, to cut a long story short. To put it into a perspective, a fundamental intellectual unity created by a common tradition is of central importance to sustain the Europeanizations of private law. What is more essential in the context of today's discussion is that the lack of a shared identity or objective to a certain degree is commensurate with actual legal pluralism. To make matter even more confusing, this legal pluralism is not limited to the regional level, but more crucially, they reflect the state of every Asian country's domestic legal system. To put it another way, I believe there are at least two forces that work to ensure that Asia's legal pluralism endure and, more importantly, determine the trajectory of any regionalization's endeavor in Asia. The first element is due to the fact that the state is weak. As a result, not only must any conceptions of law be adapted for the Asian setting, but it also highlights the fact that Asia's everyday reality is based on a pluralistic and overlapping legal orders. The second factor is the romanticized perceptions of the vernacular style of doing law that persists. As the case of Indonesia demonstrates, this yearning exists not only among lay people, but also among eminent legal intellectuals. Provided that my claims are correct, the next question is how an endeavor to establish a uniform style of conducting law is worthy of our intentions. It is worth noting, principle of Asian contract law in particular receive no support from any state. There's also the questions of why an analysis of such an improbable move or initiative is worthy of our time. Here are my response. My answer to the first question is practical. To the first questions, I have that is by realizing how the principle of Asian contract law project might assist us in understanding why it fails in the first place. I predict that a similar move to introduce a new version of principle of Asian contract law will soon be made. The rationale for this is that as we move toward a more internationally integrated economy, it is evident that a common contract law is desirable. In this context, the growing pressure for various domestic players on Indonesia to take the UNIDROIT principles of international commercial contract and the international conventions on the sales of goods more seriously should be seen in that light. On top of all that, regional law, in contrast from the global law, will be easier to accept and therefore implement. The second reasons why insightful analysis on principle of Asian contract law merit our intention is that it contributes to our theoretical understanding of engaging law as a transplanted institutions. In this instance, Alexander's insight is a valuable contribution to comparative legal practice and theory. In other words, Alexander has gone beyond merely studying and answering whether or not it is a successful enterprise. Alexander, among other things, resurrect the age-old question of whether lawful transfer, whether legal transfer is really attainable, and the subject of principle of contract law, ASEAN contract law, is without a doubt the best place to start learning about it. Contract law, in instance, is thought to be value natural or just a set of technical rather than cultural issues. With that out of the way, I suppose it's time to turn to Alexander and Dan. Similar to previous sessions, Dan, my colleague and friend, will lead the presentation in a conversational manner. Also, the translation in Bahasa will be available too. Rio will serve as your translator. Without further ado, I hope you will find the following conversations will be insightful. Thank you. Roberta.
Thank you, Mr. Pranato, for the delightful speech given. Now, finally, we will be coming to the main session. Let us begin with the legal speaking series with our Dr. Ear Alexander Gerbano, accompanied by Mr. Dan Trevenan. Before we turn to Dan, if you have questions, please write them on the Zoom chat. Please to be as clear as possible in articulating your questions. Well, let us begin now, and you can have the time, Mr. Dan Trevenan.
Thank you so much, Alberta, and thank you, Alexander, for joining us today. To give, I think, a little bit more fulsome introduction to yourself, Alexander, you're an assistant professor and member of the Faculty of Law at the University of Warsaw, chair for European Legal Tradition and Warsaw Center for Transnational Law, and a member of the Research and Analysis Office in the Supreme Court of the Republic of Poland. So we're very, very grateful for you to give us your time today to speak on a really interesting topic. There's a lot to unpack, and I'm really grateful for Pran, I think, for introducing some questions which we can use to sort of begin our discussion. And one of them is about whether this project, this endeavor is worth it. Can you talk to us a little bit about the principles of Asian contract law as a project, where it originated from, and give us a landing pad for us to launch into this discussion?
Okay, thank you, Dan, for this introduction. Of course, yes. When it comes to the origins of this project, the principles of Asian contract law, we should get back in the past by 10 years, because it started to 2009, as 4 law professors from China, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea met and had this idea during a conference that such principles could be drafted. They've signed, it's called Beijing Agreement on Principles of Asian Contract Law, so some basic rules on how to organize the works, and so they started. The project was definitely inspired by the European experiences, as in Europe the legal integration is very profound due to political will, but also the common legal heritage and education. We've already drafted at the beginning of the 21st century so-called European principles of contract law. So the idea of these principles was to create a toolbox which is based on common legal heritage, but can serve for the future. A kind of ready solutions for legislator, for contract parties, for arbitration to solve practical problems. And the same goals were the goals of the 4 law professors that met in Beijing. The way they've organized their works well, it differs a little bit from the European ideas, but nevertheless, they've decided to draft a chapter after chapter. We've divided the whole area of contract law into several main areas, and each national team has prepared a basic draft for a certain chapter, and then it was discussed and commented upon by other members of the entire project from another Asian countries. And so, well, my research, it was to, on one hand, to evaluate the way they were drafting these principles. On the other hand, the whole project is a point of departure for more theoretical conclusions about what's the nature of law and the nature of cross-border legal unification or harmonization, how it works.
Thanks for that overview, and I want to dive into that a little bit deeper in a moment. But you mentioned some of the European parallels. We know obviously there's the UNIDROIT principles, the principles of international commercial contracts, and there's the CISG, the United Nations Convention on Contracts for the International Sale of Goods. So there are examples of this harmonization, this unification of a code. Just stepping back, what are the benefits of these codes more generally, and what are these founders of the Principles of Asian Contract Law project, what are they trying to achieve that these other projects have succeeded in?
Thank you for that question. I would differentiate between 2 issues. The first one is, what are the desired goals of the principles, and what are the real, what is the real impact? And the same, it applies same for Europe and for Asia. So when it comes to Europe, the previous main idea was to make a common law of contract for all European countries that could be accepted and implemented in all European countries. So it was a very optimistic project, Well, it started at the beginning of the 90s, practically, and was a very optimistic era, because after the end of the Cold War and collapse of the Berlin Wall, there was a hope for a real political and legal cooperation between all European democratic and free countries. It turned out it's too optimistic, but the real impact that I think is the most important thing here is that this works. And finally, the drafted principles have enhanced discussion about the contract law. A discussion that go beyond narrow national understanding of what contract law is. And I think the same applies for Asia. I would say it's a futurology to expect that the contract laws of Asia will be instantly unified by drafting such principles. As far as I know, the legal pluralism in Asia is much more profound than in Europe. So there are very many more obstacles for that enterprise. But certainly, though there should be discussion around this principle, around this project, that would enhance the creation of a common Asian legal science. So more cross-border cooperation that will step by step lead to finding out common solution for common problems.
I really like that because it brings us into the discussion about what is Asia, and it ties in nicely with how you've described the Principles of Asian Contract Law project organizing their committees to write these draft articles. You mentioned that they essentially have country-led committees, particularly Taiwan, China, South Korea, and Japan. And I know now that they do have some committees, I think, in Southeast Asian countries. But Asia is made up of something about 50-odd countries, each with their own local experiences. Is it possible to have a principle of Asian contract laws?
A very good question. No one knows what Asia is, because the answers for the question are many. Well, I've tried to sum it up in my paper, showing that maybe the main idea is that Asia extends from India and the south throughout Indonesia, Philippines, up to China and Japan. But it's of course not the exact geographical area of Asia. And some of the ideas restrict even the countries I've already mentioned to some smaller group. So of course that's a problem. That's a basic problem. If we want to draft principles of Asian law, we need to describe what Asian law is and what Asia is. And the basic fundamental, I would dare to say, mistake of the authors of this project is that they neglected this fundamental idea. They've jumped over this problem. I don't want to say it's easy to solve, but they've jumped over it and started drafting something they don't even exactly know what it is. That's my idea. If I can, and another problem is not only what countries should be involved, but also what are the levels of law involved. I mean, in the in the world of legal pluralism, we have the legal systems of national states, but we have also some local laws. And moreover, there are official law, the written one, and the unofficial one, which is practiced, but can differ from the official one. I have the impression that the authors of the project have focused on the law in books, which is not a bad idea. It's a kind of drafting a summary of the doctrine. But if the doctrine differs too much from circumstances of social life, then they won't be applicable. No one will follow them simply. So the point is, do you want to make an academic discussion, or are we pragmatic and are we drafting something that we really think might be applied in the future?
Mm. The issue of different levels of law, I think, is a very interesting one, particularly as many of the listeners at the moment would be familiar in the Indonesian context. You have sort of a civil code, which is a leftover from the Dutch colonial period. Then you have adat, which is your sort of customary local law. And then in certain regions in Aceh, you have Sharia law as well. How, if in any way, is that being captured by the PACL project, that sort of level of diversity?
Unfortunately, not at all. Indonesia had some representatives in the works of this international team, but one of the characteristics of this project is that the preliminary drafts of certain chapters of the principles were drafted in China, Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan, and all other countries could only comment upon. So when I was searching the contents of certain provisions, it turned out that they reflect these four main countries, participants, and transnational law, the soft model principles as principles of international commercial contracts or of European contract law, and they have not they don't follow the law of the Southeastern Asia, and we still talk about the official law, because no mentions there is about adat or about the religious laws. So I suppose it's a purely doctrinal discussion that, of course, might be fruitful, but if we think in terms of creating an applicable instrument, I don't think it will work. I don't think people won't understand it or won't be willing to follow it because of religious or customary motivations.
I want to sort of turn to maybe some practical examples where we can maybe tease out this question of, is there an Asian element of law or value in law? And if we look at, and I found it very difficult to find the draft articles of the PACL project, but I understand that you've maybe got a little bit more insight. What are some of the differences in the way that they've drafted clauses, for example, about good faith or any other sort of common contractual clause, to the way that some of the Western countries have created their codes?
Well, I won't say we can find any distinct Asian provisions in the principles. I mean, nothing that is so much striking that you see it immediately when you look in the principles. But of course, it doesn't mean that no Asian values or customs can enter this draft. When you apply general clauses, so for example, refer to social practices or good faith, as you've said, these are doors for the local values, because it's crucial how we understand the good faith or some social values, customs in a certain place where the contract is being concluded or executed. Yes. So of course, the drafters must have had something in their minds, but in practice, the courts, I would say, will have their own vision of what good faith is. For example, what is the extent we can negotiate a change of contract, let's say, just due to some changed circumstances. We've just experienced the great COVID pandemic. It has had an enormous impact on supply chains of different commercial relations, and certainly it has changed a lot, so that some performances stipulated in contracts aren't actual anymore, are not able to be executed, or are able to be executed, but on a cost that is unbearable for the debtor. So the point is, what are the local ideas of how far can we go in renegotiating contracts, for instance? Yeah, but it's not an example that directly attaches to Asian character of law or Asian laws, but it's rather a kind of blank, how do you say it, a model, a typical problem that appears in all contract law legislation, that there are provisions which refer to local and extra legal norms.
So from my perspective, what I found plausible, at least, for what do I conceptualize as potentially an Asian-ness to the law in this region, would be that on the whole, countries are perhaps a little bit more community-based. There has been research which shows these countries are less about the individual and more about the community. And as an example, I think that you brought up a repealed part of the PRC code, so the civil code in China, when taking into account what good faith meant, it's shaped by factors such as contributing to social stability, which at least in Australia, the jurisdiction, you wouldn't necessarily have that factor. Is that something that strikes you as maybe being a plausible basis for this project, that we're searching for nuggets like that one? Or is that really just sort of maybe something less substantive than is needed to sustain a project of this level and size?
I find an interesting contribution of something we can call sustainability idea in the contract law, which might be said it's typical for Asia. I mean, generally, your societies think rather in terms of community than individuals, like in Australia or Western Europe or United States. Of course, also in Europe, there are ideas that attach the meaning of certain rights to the impact on social life they have. But these are, let's say, controversial ideas that are being discussed since 100 years, more or less, but are not a prevailing attitude of the society. So, for instance, when I look in the Chinese code, I thought, the social stability, the goals that the social goals of a certain right, these I associate them with socialism, with or communist ideas, because in the Soviet Union and also in the satellite states of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe, there were such clauses. Even now in Poland, we say that while executing rights, we need to act in good faith. It's exactly it said, in accordance with the principle of social cooperation, and that a certain right has to fulfill its social and economic goal. So it sounds familiar, yes? But when I start researching it deeper, I find out that the Polish legal scholars, while drafting our code in the 1960s, they were influenced by French doctrine of the social responsibility of the bearer of rights. So when you are owner of a piece of land, you can enjoy your ownership, but you need to remember about your neighbors, of course. Yeah, you can't. I mean, the piece of land you own, it has a certain function, social function, and this is an idea which is not condivided by all, but it sounds very familiar to what I suppose is the predominant attitude in East and Southeast Asia. So
The other thing
there are some local ideas, but they might be found also in another edge of the world, unexpectedly.
Well, sometimes expectedly as well, and that sort of was bringing me to my next line of thinking, which was if we take the Indonesian context, where you do have a clear influence from the Dutch regime that was here before, and that's very common across other countries in Asia as well, as to have remnants of another society's code or laws. Is it useful to try and disentangle the two? Or really should, for the context of this project, should they just be looking at the law as it is now with Western influences, be as it may?
That's a very difficult question. I will try to answer you by giving an example from the history of Polish law. Namely, the Polish state has disappeared in the end of the 18th century. Poland was quite a big country, but was very weak and has been partitioned by its neighbors. So for over a century, Poland has disappeared from the political map of Europe. The nation has survived, so after 100 years, we have regained independence in 1918. And there appeared the question, what law should be applied in the new state or the renewed state? The problem was that the old law, the original Polish law, has been forgotten, hasn't been applied anymore because the occupants have imposed their codes, their own codes. So we, at the dawn of our independence, we had 5 different legal orders in Poland. So 5 regions with 5 different codes when it comes to civil law only, because in penal law and other branches, there was also some diversity. And the question was, should we turn back to this old law from the 18th century? No. The answer was no, it's impossible because it's not adjusted to the economic and social circumstances anymore. It's not recorded entirely because it was not all of this was written. And we should inherit, so to say, the foreign laws and make them our own. And in the course of codification process, we've merged all these 5 legal orders, choosing the best solution from each of them, and created a hybrid system. It's a kind of mixed legal system of the civilian tradition, so there is no common law, but it's a mixed legal system, mixed jurisdiction. And it convinces me, as far as I see very many practical obstacles in turning back through centuries and trying to find the original law in the past. It might be difficult. And when they even find it, it might be not applicable to what we have today, to the new means of technology, communication, the globalization, yeah, we face. So I would say it's, of course, it's also a matter of emotions, of national pride, of national identification. So sometimes we try to underline that we have something own, yeah, something which is peculiar for our country, our homeland. But I would say we should be pragmatic.
Mm. And I think that pragmatism is what, for me, as I read your article, really stood out as being a tension point for the founders of the PACL project, in that it seemed to me that at its foundations, the project seeks to be at once local in its deriving of source law, source material, but also international in its application across, harmonizing, unifying laws. Is that irreconcilable? I mean, we have seen other forms of this unification take place, but to me, as I look at it in the Asian context, it just seems particularly acute.
Well, it is acute in the Asian context, but not due to some special circumstances, the legal geography of Asia, but due to the fact that the global soft law, the global model rules, I mean, principles of international commercial contracts, the Convention of International Sales of Goods, which is not soft law, but the treaty, but still, it's what I mean is they are fruits of the Western, European and American doctrine. So in the introduction to, in the preface to all these collections of rules, it's written that they are global, that rules from different countries have been merged to create something international, applicable everywhere. But in fact, the drafters were European or American, and the sources were European or American. So in effect, it's a transfer of Western rules and ideas onto the world. So in that sense, everything that appears outside Europe is peculiar because it's international or tries to be transnational or global, whereas trying to be different from what's already global. Yeah. So there's an inner contradiction. You're right that according to sources, it's the PACL project is a regional one, but the technique, the aims are transnational. So there will be another collection applicable in the in transnational affairs, which is neither good nor bad. I mean, the parties to the contract are free to choose the law they would like their contract to be governed. The international arbitration will be free to choose the rules for solving legal disputes. There was an argument raised by Stefan Wogenauer that creating new collections of the sort might lead to fragmentation of the law. So the idea of the harmonization will be undermined by new collections joining the family of soft law. But turn out that these rules are not applied so frequently, certainly not in legal circulation of certain nation states, but rather in arbitration. And even in the arbitration, they are not so frequent. So when the statistics say when people are choosing which law should be applied in the arbitration court, it's mainly the American law, the Swiss law, or English law, and transnational soft law principles and rules only on the 5th place. Yeah, so drafting principles of Asian contract law is not a threat to the existing system, but it enriches it. The question is, of course, if they are really Asian. So we turn back to the previous, the preceding questions. Yeah, if they are really Asian, then they will enrich the legal supermarket. If they are not, there will be simply another. There will be the Western rules, so to say, digested. Yeah, and systemized in another way.
I think that's a nice way of drawing us back a little bit in a circle to taking a look at PACL as a whole. In your paper, you've suggested that they have, or they should take, a hard course reset. And I think you're quite good in providing what I saw as quite tangible steps they could do to improve the project. Do you want to describe some of those suggestions and where you would like to see the project move to?
Okay. Referring to what I've said at the beginning, the project lacks methodological foundations. So we first need to ascertain what Asia and Asian law is. Of course, I mean, there's no Asian law in the normative sense, but in the doctrinal sense, what we would like the Asian law to be. Rather of the technical one. I mean, the way really regular. I mean, if each chapter, preliminary draft of each chapter is made by different national team, then there are different then the project is imbalanced. So one chapter will be more Chinese, another more Japanese, yes? Whereas when we draft such model rules in Europe, we made one standard commission whose composition is fixed from the very beginning, where representatives of all involved countries are, and the composition of that team cannot change throughout the project, or the changes must be only minor ones, so that on each stage, in each chapter we are drafting, the proportions between, or the influences from different countries are proportional. Because it's obvious that each country wants to impose its view on the project. That's natural, because if, let's say, if the Chinese make the principles of Asian contract law more Chinese, it will be easier to apply them in China. If the Indonesians make them more Indonesian, it will be more likely to be applied in your country, or by your businessmen. So the point is that on the technical level, the composition of the project team, the calendar of works should be more stable and more just, so to say. Whereas now some countries are dominating the whole project, which is, okay, we can say unfair, but it doesn't allow us to really harmonize all laws of the countries that are interested in that project. Yeah? So these are my basic ideas of what should be changed within this principle of Asian contract law project.
I've got a few more general questions outside of the PACL project. So I encourage anyone listening to start thinking about your own questions, and you can write them in the chat as we start to wrap things up. But one of the things that you touched on there is the likelihood of one country's legislators or business people using the various principles once they're published. Could you touch a little bit on the idea of these principles as a source of soft law, and what effect do they have on legislators, policymakers, business people? What have we seen in Europe, and what could we expect of the PACL project in Asia?
All right. So let's start with the principles of European contract law, which from the scratch were an academic project. They were academic private initiative, although financed by the European Commission. So the European institutions have found it interesting as a starting point for discussion about more harmonization, the deeper harmonization in Europe. But nevertheless, it was an academic project. So the first main underlying idea was to enhance discussion among scholars, and it has worked a lot. So when you look at publications from the mid 90s, beginning of the 21st century, there are very many references in papers that regard national law only, showing that a certain solution is applied in our country, but it can be made different. As an example, see principles of European contract law. Yeah, that's the first thing. Second thing is the impact on legislation. It is maybe far more modest than expected, but still there are interesting examples. For instance, countries of the Eastern Europe that were formerly parts of the Soviet Union and had a very old-fashioned and not very democratic law, have earned a lot from the principles of European contract law. The new contract law of countries like Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, so the Baltic states from the Eastern and Northern Europe, are mainly based on the principles of European contract law. So they found these rules as the most modern formulation of the European doctrine, which should be followed. The idea was, why should we follow some older legislation when the European contract law principles they respond to the most modern needs of the economic life, and it's proved. You can see it in codification materials. You can see it in the wording of the codes. Also in other countries, this soft law appears very often as an element of discussion and preparatory materials of the codification teams. So that's another second success, whereas the practical application of these principles in contract life and in arbitration is very scarce. So we can ask ourselves why. What's the reason? The reason is perhaps that the rules don't have very much doctrine erosion around them. So the rules are like skeleton without flesh, you know, whereas existing national laws are skeletons with flesh. So parties are more likely to choose, for example, the Swiss law, which is neutral for very many of the contracting parties, but has established doctrine, jurisprudence, and has solutions for very many cases which perhaps are not enshrined already in the soft law. So to sum up, in Europe, there's a success in terms of enhancing academic cooperation and discussion. Another success when it comes to supporting the legislator with some ready solutions. But in arbitration, in practice, in legal practice, the principles are not so frequently applied. And I suppose for Asia, it might be more or less similar. Yeah. So the easiest way, the easiest aim we can achieve is enhancing scholarly life. Second is eventually drafting new codes. A good example is Vietnam, because as far as I know, they were drafting their civil code in such a way that they were benefiting from the principles of Asian contract law, while also commenting with on the principles basing on their own Vietnamese law. So there was some mutual exchange between the drafters of the Vietnamese code and drafters of the principles.
The other question I wanted to touch on, which you do deal with in your paper, and I know Pran mentioned it in his introduction, is the idea of contract law as a specific field of law, perhaps being more neutral than other forms of law. And I could compare that to human rights law, which I think could be seen to be much more relative to certain contexts. And in fact, in certain international forums, you see that play out quite vividly. But there's a perception that contract law is perhaps culturally neutral. Do you want to have a go at that sort of claim, and where do you position yourself on that claim?
I regret, but I think I need to disappoint you. I will. One question mark appeared in my head if the contracts are culturally neutral. So this whole idea that we can draft Asian contract law principles means no, they're not neutral. There are contracts that are more European or more Asian. Yeah, to simplify the problem. But while comparing the fruits of this project with another model rules, as we've discussed, despite these general clauses that are open for the local understanding of certain terms, all the provisions are more or less similar. So honestly, I don't know. But I think it's a good starting point. Well, in human rights, it's an ongoing discussion, yeah, since many years. But maybe it's because the human rights touch a greater variety of situations that happen in our lives. I mean, they touch some criminal law, some contract law, property issues, inheritances, religious freedom, and in contract, it's really more technical, maybe, I would say, but I'm not sure of that answer. I still believe that there might be some cultural imprint on the contract law, but I can't say exactly where or how it works. So, but it's good to start from a good question.
Absolutely. So to wrap it up, a last question I had, which was, I found it quite an intriguing quote that you had by Uwe Kischel, that Asia could well be a paradise for comparative lawyers. And there's many Asian lawyers, academics listening to this talk at the moment. So as someone who, as I understand it, a lot of your research interests have been in Roman law and succession law, in European law, and now you've branched out and really dug into Asia as a field of study. What is it about Asia that's different from Europe that you can perhaps commend to some of the people doing research that are watching this episode today? All
right. So first, I would like to recommend you the handbook of Uwe Kischel, which has appeared in its English translation several years ago. It's really a good stuff, especially because most handbooks on comparative law are written by scholars who deal with private law, whereas Uwe Kischel is his scope of interest is constitutional and administrative law. So he has a little bit more objective, different perspective. So it's a good book. I like this quote because it has really a paradise for somebody who is academically dealing with comparative law methodology and comparative law theory. It's because in Europe the things are much more simple. When we look when we recall the history of law in Europe, its foundations is Roman law. So the most part of Europe in the antiquity was part of Roman Empire, and Romans had their law. It was very, very developed. And after the collapse of this empire, new states that have emerged in Europe have inherited these rules, these principles, and developed and developed. There was one language spoken in Europe, it was Latin. Even if people then spoke different languages in their homes, at the universities it was Latin and Roman law in all universities. So basically, despite the fact that people were living in different countries, speaking different languages, having even different legislation, the legal education was uniform. And we can say today, when there are differences within among the codes of different countries, they originate from some doctrinal legal controversies of the Roman jurists from the past centuries. So they are basically, if the differences have same roots, the only a part of Europe that is distinct are the British Isles. So England and Ireland, they have the common law is different from the law of the continental Europe. But in the continental Europe, there's a very deep coherence among the legal systems. So when a European scholar enters Asia and sees that there is the post-colonial heritage, there are old laws of the countries once occupied by Europeans. There are customs, there are religion laws, there are different layers, there's the pluralism, and even within the legislation, there's a kind of interesting paths of borrowing. So, for example, the Taiwan has this codification, which is taken from Japan, which have taken the codification borrowed from Germany. There's so I would say the legal battlefield is much more complex than in Europe, and it's. I think we should be more humble as comparatists and more sensitive to all these differences, because when we draft our principles, trying to harmonize, unify law, we are optimists and we want to see similarities. But in fact, there are very many differences, and we need to be aware of them. Asia shows that solutions are often much more difficult to achieve than we think. But we shouldn't. But it shouldn't be an obstacle that stops our enterprises, of course.
I think that's a great place to finish up, and I agree completely. Particularly in your article, I always got the sense that you were approaching this project, yes, with criticisms, but also with some optimism that you believe in this sort of endeavor to harmonize and to help globalize some of the regional ideas that are here in Asia. So thank you for giving us time, Alexander, and for sharing your thoughts. I might go back to Alberta and we'll open up for some questions.
Okay.
Also, thank you.
Okay, so we will be having some question and answer. Everyone can actually write their questions. Please write them on the Zoom chat, and please to be as clear as possible in articulating your questions. Do you see any? Okay, there's a questions.
Okay, I might read it out, Alberta. So this is from Unita, a lecturer at Trisakti University. In her understanding, compared with the CSIG and PACL, PACL's not a convention. Therefore, it does not have any binding sort of force of law. Can it be said that PACL may be a good supplement to the CSIG in practice?
You are absolutely right. You don't have any force of law. They are soft law in the sense they have some authority given by the drafters that are experienced academics, but they don't have the force of law. So when there will be a competition between rules of the CISG and Principles of Asian Contract Law, then the first will prevail, of course. I suppose it depends on the case, but if we compare and there is really a loophole in the convention which can be filled by principle, why not? Why not? It's a question what the parties agree for.
Thank you for that answer. Another question, this one from Hakel, also from Trisakti University. We've talked a lot about the challenges of legal pluralism in Asia as a challenge and an obstacle. Question is, how should Asia then harmonize its contract laws? Should there be an Asian harmonization for contract law, or should Asian nations adopt internationally negotiated contract law?
Well, there are two approaches to be taken. Either you can make a convention, international treaty, presupposing that there will be political will for such a treaty. That's of course tricky. But if we have such a convention, it will have the force of law. Question is whether people will be willing to apply it. If such a treaty will be coherent with the local legal ideas. Another approach is this of slowly building a common doctrine. So researching the laws, comparing them, and trying to make some conclusion. What are the points, common points that could be considered a foundation for a future soft law or future treaty. So if we think from bottom up, and so we develop our legal doctrine, or the other way around, we impose something that might not necessarily work.
I'll ask for more questions to keep coming on in, but while we wait, I might tack on a question to that one, Alexander, which was, when we think about negotiated contract law treaties versus these more academic-driven enterprises, what have you seen as an academic for the appetite for these sort of academic-based projects to spur sources of soft law? Is it a fertile industry, or is it one which is few and far between?
I mean, have I understood you correctly that you mean how fruitful is such an academic discussion? Yes?
Not just fruitful, but how common is it in the context of, is it supported by academic institutions compared to other potential research interests that universities have?
Mm-hmm. Well, I know it's different. It depends. Here I see the principle of Asian contract law initiative as a really private initiative. So the members of the team are making use, of course, of the resources of their universities, but no government supports them. Yeah, and whereas in Europe it was much easier having the resources provided by some European institutions. But as a result, we still have an academic project that might be acknowledged by some official institution. So it can turn into treaty or a statute, or might not, and will have only academic influence. The problem with this bottom-up approach is that we don't know how long it might take. In Germany, it took nearly 100 years. In Switzerland, it took like 30 years. Now we are living fast in the era of globalization, so maybe we shouldn't be afraid of such long periods anymore, but it's difficult to assess.
I think Michael's got a question and it's just coming in, but what you just mentioned did spark something for me. Oh, we got Unita with another question. If the parties wish to apply PACL for their contracts, should it be included in the choice of law clause? That would generally be contracts arbitration clauses.
Well, I think it should. If the parties would like to be sure that these rules will be applied in case of any legal dispute between them. My view is that if there is freedom of contract, which is a rule rather common for different jurisdictions worldwide, the parties are free to choose the law they like to. They like their contract to be governed, and why not? I mean, this arbitration clause is the choice of law clause is gives more security for the parties. Because I don't think the arbitration court would pick the principles of Asian law by himself as a basis to resolve some some conflict between parties.
Thank you for that question, Unita. Any other questions, please keep them coming. I wonder if actually, Pran, you're still on the line, I assume. Did we resolve any of the questions which you asked us at the start? Do you have anything to add?
No, I think that's a very wonderful expositions, I think, about what in particular about how we should do a comparative legal research in non-Western context. So to be more, careful in terms of about how we should understand law, where law itself probably becomes different, manifestations, or because of the influence of the context, so maybe become, maybe distortions or something. So I think, so that's the reasons why I think Alexander is appropriate for, delivering his point of view of how we should approach law in Asian context. How difficult is that? So I think that would be, and also I think what makes and Alexander is interesting is that Alexander tends to focus less on a political consideration to reveal the nuance of Asian way or the legal pluralism in Asia, and how it's typical to reconcile between, even in East Asia, it's very difficult within East Asia. So maybe one of the reasons, so there's another reasons, maybe in addition to, what we know from political science, how difficult is, to come up with what do we mean by Asia. And also maybe Alexander can what makes, so I think Tiffany asked questions, so I think then we should answer Tiffany.
You're cutting yourself off, Pran. But yes, we do have another question from Tiffany for Alexander. In your opinion, do you think PACL is a competing or complementary strategy for open regionalism? And this is coming from a Juris Doctor student from La Trobe University in Australia.
All right, but first let me comment on Pran's remark. Thank you very much for this remark. I like it a lot, and I've had immediately an idea, which I think that hasn't been said maybe so clearly. Look, we have law which is official, and we have this so-called unofficial law in each country. Now the principles are also unofficial in a certain sense. If there are so many layers of law which don't necessarily have the sanction of a state, like religious laws also, the Sharia or the canon law, they are independent from states. Why shouldn't we adopt more soft approach? Yeah, because approach that takes into account only what is law is inefficient when you have normative phenomena of different sort. So that I want to say, not to forget about, and referring to Tiffany's question, I think the principles are a complementing strategy. So because they are not imposed on anyone, yeah, they are a private consensual enterprise, so they do not compete with anyone. Also because they don't have any binding force. So I would say in regional integration, it's important to apply different strategies or different instruments, because you never know which will work. And with such a complementary approach, it's more likely that you succeed.
Wonderful. Well, if there's no further questions, I might sort of sum up and remind us that the topic of this talk was the principles of Asian contract law at the crossroads of standardization and legal pluralism. And I'm really glad to have had your help, Alexander, unpacking where we are currently on those crossroads and charting a little bit ahead as to where we can move on that endeavor of standardization, harmonization, unification, globalization. And really, I think founding that discussion was teasing out this idea of what is Asian contract law, what is Asia, and what are the cultural influences that are impacting this project, and how those can be, let's say, mitigated or addressed in a way which will really promote the endeavors of that project. So join me with everyone listening to thank Alexander for his time, and we greatly appreciate it.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you, Mrs. Dean. Thank you, Pran. Thank you, Dan. It was a great pleasure, and I'm really thankful for the stimulating questions that allowed me to rethink a little bit what I've already written some time ago. So
Wonderful.
thanks
I
a
hope
lot.
we can have another discussions for your next project.
Excellent. Well, back to you, Alberta, and thanks again, obviously, to Trisakti University for providing the forum and many of the excellent questions for the talk this evening. So thank you.
Okay, so we'll be actually having a 5 minutes conclusion, like just in short, so you may have the time.
Who's the conclusion by Alberta?
No, by Mr. Dan Trevenan, actually, like just in short. Mhm.
I think I've just summed it up already.
Oh, okay. So, finally, we have come out to our last session. Everyone's photo can be taken. Para hadirin sekalian, mohon untuk menyalakan kamera untuk sesi foto kami. So, please open your camera, audience, because we'll be taking the photos soon. I will be taking the photos at one. I'm so sorry before. So my internet is a bit lag. Can the committee take the pictures of the audience? Or maybe can the moderator take the photos first? Since I was like having some internet lag.
Dan, can you take a picture?
Yes.
I think I can. I'll have to work this out. Mas Satrio, are you on? Can you take the photo?
Yes. Can the committee take the photos?
We're all smiling very well, though, while we wait.
Please do open your camera because we'll be taking the photos. So,
Have you got those, Mas Satrio?
okay, should I just take the photo? It's not lagging right now already. So let's just,
Go for it, Alberta.
okay, let me just take the photo. Okay, 1, 2, and 3. Cheers. Okay, another section, another slide. 1, 2, and 3. The third slide. 1, 2, and 3. And the last slide. 1, 2, and 3. Okay, wonderful. Okay, so at last, we have come up to the end of the session. On behalf of the Trisakti Faculty of Law, I would like to express once again our gratitude to Mr. Alexander Grobano for sharing his knowledge and his wisdom with us. I totally understand it's also getting late in Poland, so of course, Mr. Alexander will be probably doing another activities after this. And on behalf of the Trisakti Faculty of Law, I would like to thank our audience as well. We like to further inform that legal speaking series that is held today is a bi-monthly event. So I'm expecting that there will be another event and we will be meeting soon. For more information, audience will be provided further information through email and WhatsApp by the committee. We would also like to apologize if there are some words are off the limit. And thank you so much for your attention, audience.
Thank you, Alexander. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye. Bye. Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti didirikan pada tanggal 29 November 1965, bersamaan dengan berdirinya Universitas Trisakti yang dikenal sebagai Kampus Pahlawan Reformasi. Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti terletak di Kampus A, Jalan Kiai Tapa, Jakarta Barat. Menempati Gedung H, Gedung Profesor Budi Harsono. Terdiri atas 9 lantai, dilengkapi dengan sarana-prasarana yang mampu mewujudkan visi-misi, serta menunjang pelaksanaan Tridharma Perguruan Tinggi.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti didirikan pada tanggal 29 November 1965 bersamaan dengan didirikannya Universitas Trisakti. Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti memiliki 3 program studi. Program studi Sarjana Ilmu Hukum dengan 7 peminatan, program studi Magister Ilmu Hukum, dan program studi Doktor Ilmu Hukum. Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti telah memperoleh akreditasi A sebanyak 5 kali berturut-turut sejak tahun 1998 dan telah memperoleh sertifikasi internasional dari ASEAN University Network atau AUN QE pada tahun 2021.
Program kekhususan Hukum Bisnis, Hukum Keluarga, Hukum Agraria, Hukum Pidana, Hukum Internasional Publik, Hukum Acara, serta Hukum Pemerintahan dan Perundang-undangan. Proses belajar mengajar dibimbing oleh dosen yang berkompeten dengan latar belakang akademisi dan praktisi hukum, serta didukung oleh pimpinan fakultas yang berkomitmen terhadap tercapainya visi misi.
Dalam menghadapi era revolusi industri 5.0, Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti turut membentuk generasi kreatif, inovatif, dan kompetitif. Maka, kurikulum operasional dievaluasi berkala yang saat ini menggunakan kurikulum dengan kerangka kualifikasi nasional berbasis outcome-based education, yang juga melaksanakan kebijakan pemerintah Merdeka Belajar Kampus Merdeka, yang untuk percepatan dan peningkatan mutu luaran SDM, kami juga memiliki program Fast Track dengan strategi pembelajaran Student Centered Learning, dengan metode pembelajaran e-learning dan blended learning dengan memanfaatkan ketersediaan sumber belajar digital yang disiapkan oleh universitas, yaitu Pusat Pembelajaran Daring Trisakti.
Kurikulum yang diterapkan telah sesuai dengan kerangka kualifikasi nasional Indonesia yang berbasis pada outcome-based education, serta mendukung program pemerintah, yaitu Merdeka Belajar Kampus Merdeka. Terdapat juga Fast Track Program yang merupakan program untuk meraih gelar Sarjana Hukum sekaligus Magister Ilmu Hukum yang dapat ditempuh hanya dalam waktu 10 semester.
Untuk mendukung pelaksanaan Tridharma Perguruan Tinggi, Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti memiliki sarana dan prasarana akademik maupun non-akademik yang memadai, modern, dan selalu diperbarui demi mendukung pembelajaran blended learning. Sarana prasarana tersebut antara lain ruang kuliah, ruang laboratorium hukum, ruang auditorium yang memadai dan lengkap, ruang perpustakaan dengan koleksi kepustakaan yang lengkap, baik cetak maupun digital, ruang organisasi mahasiswa, dan ruang terbuka hijau.
Saat ini, Fakultas Hukum memiliki lebih dari 2.000 mahasiswa yang berasal dari 34 provinsi di Indonesia dan luar negeri. Hal ini menunjukkan adanya keberagaman budaya sekaligus tingginya minat masyarakat untuk menempuh pendidikan di Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti.
Kegiatan kemahasiswaan di Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti telah dilaksanakan melalui lembaga kemahasiswaan, baik parlemen, BEM, OTF, dan komunitas. Berbagai prestasi telah diukir, baik tingkat nasional maupun internasional, antara lain peradilan semu, moot court, dan lomba-lomba debat lainnya, serta berbagai kegiatan olahraga dan seni.
Guna menunjang pelaksanaan Tridharma Perguruan Tinggi dan program Merdeka Belajar Kampus Merdeka (MBKM), Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti menjalin kerjasama dengan berbagai mitra kerjasama, baik di dalam dan luar negeri, yang meliputi perguruan tinggi, instansi pemerintah dan non-pemerintah, lembaga-lembaga negara, dan berbagai organisasi profesi di bidang hukum.
Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti telah mencetak lebih dari 14.000 lulusan yang bekerja di berbagai bidang profesi hukum. Hakim, jaksa, pengacara, konsultan hukum, notaris, diplomat, anggota legislatif, penggiat hak asasi manusia, dan lain-lain yang tersebar baik di dalam maupun di luar negeri.
Selamat bergabung di Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti.
Satu